In the follow-up to this week's lecture, and in preparation for next week's, we'll ask you to undertake a bit of self-directed reading. The function of this podcast is to contextualise this task, and to give some support and guidance as you're doing it. The reading you'll be undertaking is from an academic journal. These are a very special form of writing and something you should try to get used to engaging with. A number of features of journals make them unique. Firstly, they're really rigorous. To be published in a journal, your article needs to be reviewed by a panel of experts at least twice for its accuracy and for the evidence of the claims it makes. Even books, which are driven by whether there are markets for their contents, do not have this level of trustworthiness. Secondly, they are current. Journals tend to be the first place that new ideas emerge in academia, often by a margin of years. They therefore represent the cutting edge of the field. Finally, academic journal articles are concise and specific. They focus on very particular issues and problems rather than general themes. They also present you with an abstract, which summarises the aims, methodologies and outcomes of the entire article in a single paragraph. This gives you an opportunity to evaluate how useful the piece will be to you very quickly. In later podcasts, I'll be showing you how to find and download electronic journal articles so that you can engage with them independently. Here though, we'll work on how to make the most of them once you've found them. And I'll work on the assumption that you'll be working with an article that you've been given as part of your unit. In general, I'd give you two pieces of advice on your reading, both of which relate to the degree to which you monitor your emotive and cognitive states whilst you're reading. Most fundamentally then, stay calm and carry on. This I can't emphasise strongly enough. The emotive barrier that worry and fear can establish in the learning process is profound, so relax and go with it. Here's a bit of permission that might help. You don't have to understand everything. When I read academic work, I certainly don't. In most articles, there's a good 10% which goes right over my head. And in some, I might only understand 10% properly. Here's the secret though. All of this is fine. As long as you get something from the bits that make sense to you, the whole endeavour is worthwhile. So I'd encourage you to read and keep reading. Where something isn't making sense, just keep going. You'll eventually find something to latch back onto, and often something that makes earlier sections make more sense. So then, don't panic is my first bit of advice. My second is that you should always read with a sense of purpose. Remember that there is a point to doing any bit of reading, and that point is to help you think new things. This maybe sounds a bit commonsensical, but there's a deeper significance here. You need to make sure that it's your purposes which are in charge of the process, that you own it. The minute the reading starts to be in charge, the process will lose some of its potential, and you'll find yourself adrift amongst concepts and ideas. So then, read with purpose. In the remainder of this podcast, I'm going to talk you through your next bit of reading, giving you some hints on how to make it more purposeful. To do that, you're going to need an academic journal article. So at this point, pause this podcast and go and find one, or print the one that you've been given in your unit. Okay, welcome back. Now in this process, the word squirr is going to be really important to us. Except it's not pronounced squirr, it's pronounced SQ3R, and it's an acronym. Each letter refers to a stage in the reading process. The first letter then stands for survey, and this is the first important lesson of the process. Don't just jump into the reading. Instead, spend a little bit of time looking over the structure and shape of the document. Pay attention to what the headings and subheadings say, and to the implications of the title. Try to pick out any other features which stand out to you. In the case of a journal article, you might also want to investigate the abstract of the piece. So pause this podcast again at this point, and have a go at surveying your chosen text. Start the podcast again once you've a sense of the shape of the thing that you're reading. The second stage of the SQ3R process is, I think, particularly crucial. Here, you should formulate a series of questions that you wish to answer as a result of the reading process. Some of these questions might arise from your initial survey, but all of them must be driven by your emerging interests and curiosities. It's this step that ensures that the reading process is meaningful and purposive. You should jot your questions down somewhere to ensure that you can always refer back to them. Now, pause this podcast while you undertake the task. Having formulated our questions, we can now move on to the next stage, which is actually to read the text. During this phase of the process, the trick is not to let any difficulties get you down, and to remain as active as possible. Avoid the tendency to drift off from the text and into your own daydreams. A good way of doing this is to keep returning to the questions which you've set yourself in the previous task. These offer a bit of structure to your engagement. Another strategy is to physically interact with the text, scribble notes on it, and highlight particularly pertinent points, though don't fall into my tendency of highlighting absolutely everything. Don't feel that you have to do all of the reading in one go. Let yourself have meaningful chunks of reading, and then pause if you're losing the will to live. I would, though, add 2 rules here. Firstly, if you take a break, only do so at a meaningful break in the text, at a chapter or section heading, for instance. If you break elsewhere, go back to the previous heading when you rejoin, or you'll lose the flow of the meaning. Secondly, don't leave too long of a gap between pausing and returning, or the purposefulness of your reading will be lost. Ideally, have a break long enough to make a brew or something similar, time to rest your brain without losing momentum. A favourite strategy of mine is to go and clean the kitchen and mull over the things that I've read as I do. But obviously you're a bunch of students, so this is unlikely. With all of this in mind, pause the podcast now and read the article. Restart it once you've completed. Okay, well done, but you're not quite finished yet. The penultimate step of the process is to revisit the questions you set earlier on. Consider the extent to which you've answered them, or more likely, what new questions or thinking have occurred through the process. Use this as a space, perhaps, to extend what you'd anticipated the reading would be about, perhaps summarising the key messages of the piece, and going back and highlighting particularly important and interesting paragraphs. Pause the podcast again so that you can undertake this step. The final step of the SQ3R system is to review. Here, our emphasis is on looking back and looking forward. So you should take stock of what you've thought and learned through the reading, and also consider how it's prompted new directions and ideas that you will pursue in the future. I'd encourage you at this point to always do a bit of writing, 2 or 3 paragraphs in which you respond to the text, exploring what you think in response to it and where you're heading next. Doing this will make sure that you carry forward the notion of reading serving your purposes into the writing process, and provide notes in the future that are more than just summary, and instead represent a critical and informed engagement. So I'll end this podcast at that point, and leave you to undertake the review stage. As you do that, I'll leave you with the most important piece of information from this podcast, so that it remains fresh in your heads.